A crystal chandelier trembled faintly above the ballroom as Lincoln Hale lifted his glass and smiled for the cameras. "She couldn't keep up with the life I built," he said lightly, drawing a ripple of laughter. Some people are meant to be left behind. Beside him, Sienna Vale stood flawless, admired untouched by consequence. At a quiet table near the front, a woman in a wheelchair said nothing. Nova Whitlock did not look away. The room applauded the wrong person, and none of them realized who had paid for the night. If you believe dignity should never be traded for ambition, stay with this story until the very end. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. Subscribe if you value stories where truth doesn't shout but still wins. Before the accident, before the silence settled into the corners of their marriage, there had been a version of their life that felt, at least on the surface, balanced. Nova Whitlock had never been a woman who needed attention to define her presence. In rooms where others performed, she observed. In conversations where others filled the air, she listened. It was not shyness, it was calibration. She preferred information over noise patterns, over impressions. And she had been raised in an environment where quiet control mattered more than visible power. Whitlock Capital did not advertise its influence. It didn't need to. Its reach extended through layered investments, structured funds, and silent partnerships that shaped companies without ever appearing in press releases. Nova had grown up inside that system, not as a figurehead, but as someone trained to understand it. She knew how money moved. More importantly, she knew how people behaved when they believed it was theirs. Lincoln Hale had been different when she first met him. He was not subtle. That was part of his appeal. They met at a mid-scale tech conference in San Francisco, one of those events where ambition outpaced actual success. Lincoln stood out not because he was the most polished speaker, but because he believed what he was saying before anyone else did. Hale Dynamics isn't just a product, he had said during a panel, voice steady, eyes scanning the room. It's infrastructure. People just don't realize it yet. Most dismissed it as early-stage exaggeration. Nova didn't. She noticed the structure behind his pitch, the way he framed scalability, the logic beneath the projections. It wasn't refined, but it was real. Afterward, she didn't introduce herself as Whitlock. She simply said, "Your model depends too heavily on short-term user acquisition. If that fails, your burn rate collapses in under 9 months." Lincoln paused, not offended, interested. "You're the first person who said that without trying to sound impressive," he replied. "I'm not trying to sound like anything," Nova said. That was how it began. Their conversations extended beyond the conference, first over coffee, then over long, deliberate discussions about structure, risk, and vision. Lincoln was drawn to her clarity. Nova was drawn to his momentum. He moved forward. She ensured he didn't fall. When their relationship deepened, it did so without spectacle. There were no public declarations, no curated social media presence. Lincoln at the time respected that. Or perhaps he simply hadn't yet learned to value visibility over substance. The marriage followed naturally, quiet, legally precise, almost understated for two people who would later become the center of a much louder narrative. What Lincoln did not fully understand, what Nova never corrected, was the origin of his early funding. Hale Dynamics needed capital long before it attracted attention. The first injection came through a small venture entity registered under a neutral name, Alder Ridge Ventures. From there, additional funds followed through layered channels, each legally independent, each structurally connected. All of them traced back eventually to Whitlock Capital, to Nova. She did not present it as a gift. It was an investment evaluated, structured, and monitored. Lincoln believed he had secured funding through merit. In many ways he had. But merit alone had not closed those deals. Nova never took credit. She didn't need to. What mattered to her was trajectory. In the early years of their marriage, Lincoln still asked for her perspective, not formally, not as a consultant, but in the quiet hours, late evenings, when decisions felt heavier than his confidence could carry alone. "Do you think I'm moving too fast?" he asked once, pacing their living room, a half-finished pitch deck open on his laptop. Nova, seated with a tablet in her lap, didn't look up immediately. She reviewed the numbers again before answering. "You're not moving too fast," she said. "You're moving without redundancy. If one assumption fails, everything behind it collapses." Lincoln stopped pacing. "So what do I fix?" "Not fix," she corrected. "Buffer." He nodded slowly, absorbing it. Moments like that built trust, or something that resembled it closely enough. But success changes the way people interpret their own history. As Hale Dynamics began to stabilize, first securing modest contracts, then gaining traction in larger markets, Lincoln's confidence sharpened into something more visible. Interviews followed, then invitations. Panels, features, profiles. Recognition once external became internal. And with that shift came subtle changes. He interrupted more often. He listened less completely. He began finishing Nova's sentences not accurately, but confidently. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Growth requires adjustment. Visibility requires performance. Nova understood that. But she also noticed what did not return after those moments. The pauses, the questions, the space he once left for her thoughts. Instead, he filled it. There were small instances, insignificant in isolation, consistent in pattern. At a dinner with potential partners, Lincoln answered a question directed at Nova before she could respond. "She handles more of the background strategy," he said with a smile. "I focus on execution." Nova didn't correct him, not because it was accurate, but because correction in that moment would have shifted the room. And Nova preferred observation to disruption. Later that night alone, Lincoln didn't revisit it. He didn't ask if he had spoken over her. He didn't notice that more than the comment itself was what registered. Nova began to record these moments, not emotionally, but structurally. Patterns mattered. Frequency mattered. Context mattered. She kept notes the way she reviewed financial data, timestamps, situations, behavioral shifts. Not as evidence for confrontation, as information for understanding. By the time Hale Dynamics entered its first major funding round, Lincoln no longer asked for her input the way he once had. He informed her. "We're scaling faster than expected," he said one evening, pouring himself a drink before she could respond. "This next phase is going to be different." Nova watched him, measuring not the words, but the tone. "How so?" she asked. "Bigger visibility? More pressure? Different circles?" He said it as if explaining something she couldn't access. Nova nodded once. "Then your structure needs to adapt with that." Lincoln smiled faintly. "I've got it handled." He believed that. And belief, when reinforced by early success, rarely invites correction. Nova did not challenge him. She adjusted her own position instead. Her involvement became less visible, more distant, but not absent. She continued to review reports, continued to track financial flow, continued to monitor the entities connected to Hale Dynamics. Lincoln didn't notice. From his perspective, independence had simply expanded. From Nova's perspective, variables had increased. Neither of them said it out loud. But something had already begun to shift long before the accident, long before the public narrative that would eventually define them. The imbalance wasn't sudden. It was constructed quietly, decision by decision. And Nova, who had always understood systems better than appearances, recognized one thing clearly: Lincoln no longer saw the structure holding him up, only the height it gave him. The accident did not arrive as a dramatic turning point. It came without symbolism, without warning. Just impact, physics, and consequence. It was late afternoon, on the I-87, just outside the northern stretch of Manhattan, where traffic thickened without pattern. Nova had not intended to be on that road at that hour. Her schedule had shifted, one meeting extended, another rescheduled, and she adjusted without resistance, as she always did. The driver never saw the truck change lanes. Later, the reports would state it plainly: limited visibility, delayed reaction time, excessive speed from the other vehicle. A sequence of ordinary failures aligning into something irreversible. Metal folded, glass fractured. Sound collapsed into silence. Nova did not lose consciousness immediately. That would come later in fragments. What she did register briefly precisely was the absence of control. The car no longer responded. Her body did not respond. The distinction mattered. Then everything dimmed. When she woke again, it was not to clarity, but to interruption. Hospital lighting, monitors, voices speaking in measured tones, not to her, but around her. Words like spinal involvement, neurological assessment, stability before prognosis. Information, but not yet conclusions. Nova did not panic. Panic required uncertainty without structure. What she experienced instead was recognition something had changed at a level that would not reverse easily. Lincoln arrived within hours. At that point, he still moved like the man she had married, decisive, present, fully engaged. He spoke to doctors with urgency, asked direct questions, demanded clarity where possible. "How bad is it?" he asked. The doctor did not answer immediately. "We need more imaging. There's significant trauma to the lower spine. We'll know more after evaluation." Lincoln nodded, jaw tight. "Do whatever you need." He stayed that night, and the next. For a time, his presence was consistent, visible, attentive, almost anchored by the situation. He answered calls outside the room, handled updates, coordinated logistics. From the outside, it resembled devotion. Nova observed it without assigning meaning. Pain came in waves, not only physical, but informational. Each test added detail. Each consultation refined the picture. By the fourth day, the language shifted. Loss of motor function below the waist, uncertain recovery. Rehabilitation required long-term. The words were careful, but the outcome was not ambiguous. Nova listened. She asked questions, not emotional ones, but structural ones. What functions remain intact? What is the expected adaptation timeline? What support systems will be required? The doctor answered each one, slightly surprised by the precision. Lincoln stood beside her, silent during those exchanges. That silence would become familiar. In the weeks that followed, Nova transitioned from hospital to rehabilitation. The environment changed, but the reality did none. Progress was measured in centimeters, in controlled movements, in incremental independence. Lincoln visited often in the beginning. He brought updates from the company, new contracts, investor interest, expansion plans. He spoke about Hale Dynamics as something still moving forward, still growing. Nova listened, not because she needed reassurance, but because she was tracking continuity. Life outside the hospital had not paused. It had simply reorganized around her absence. "You'll be back soon," Lincoln said once too quickly. "We'll adjust everything." Nova didn't respond immediately. Everything she asked. Lincoln hesitated just briefly. "We'll figure it out." The phrasing mattered. Not certainty, not a plan, just intention. Over time, the frequency of his visits adjusted. Not abruptly, gradually. A missed afternoon became a rescheduled evening. A shortened visit became a phone call instead. The explanations were always reasonable meetings, running late, unexpected obligations, travel requirements. All true. But patterns do not rely on individual truths. They rely on accumulation. Nova noticed the intervals between his appearances before she noticed their duration. 3 days, then 4, then a week where he came only once, staying less than an hour. He still asked how she was. But the question had changed. It no longer waited for a detailed answer. It functioned as acknowledgement, not inquiry. "You okay?" he would say, already reaching for his phone as notifications lit the screen. Nova would answer, "Yes." Not because it was accurate, but because accuracy was no longer relevant to the exchange. The rehabilitation staff remained consistent. Therapists, nurses, specialists, each focused on measurable progress. They did not require emotional interpretation. They worked with data, with response, with effort. Nova aligned with that. She learned the mechanics of her new limitations with the same approach she had once applied to financial systems. Inputs, outputs, constraints. She adapted. Not quickly, not easily, but methodically. Lincoln, meanwhile, adapted differently. He began to speak less about we and more about I. I have to be in Chicago next week. I'm meeting new investors. I can't slow this down right now. Each statement was factual. Each one also repositioned the center of his world. Nova did not interrupt him. She recorded. Not physically, not yet, but mentally with the same precision she had always used. Timing, language, shifts in emphasis. One afternoon, without announcement, Lincoln arrived with a colleague from Hale Dynamics. "This is just quick," he said, almost apologetic. "They wanted to meet you." The colleague smiled politely, uncertain. Nova returned the gesture. The conversation remained surface level. Well wishes, vague encouragement, brief mentions of the company's momentum. Afterward, when they left, Nova asked only one question. Why was that necessary? Lincoln paused. They were curious. About what? He didn't answer directly. It's just, optics matter now. There was no hostility in his tone, only practicality. Nova understood that word. Optics. It meant perception. It meant presentation. It meant that somewhere in the evolving structure of Lincoln's life, her condition had been categorized not as a shared reality, but as a variable to manage. She did not argue. Arguments required shared premises. Instead, she began to formalize what she had been observing. She requested access to updated financial summaries of Hale Dynamics, casually, as if maintaining interest. Lincoln agreed without hesitation. "Of course," he said. "I'll send them over." He didn't question why. To him, it was harmless. To Nova, it was continuity. From that point forward, her days followed two parallel tracks. Physical rehabilitation measured structured, incremental, and analytical observation, reviewing documents, tracking changes, noting discrepancies. Lincoln did not see the second track. He saw improvement where it was visible, and absence where it was not. By the time Nova was discharged from rehabilitation, transitioning into a modified version of her previous life, the shift between them was no longer subtle. It was established. Lincoln no longer adjusted his pace to match hers. He expected her to adapt to his. And Nova did, externally. Internally, she recalibrated something else entirely. Not the marriage, not yet, but the system around it. Because while Lincoln had begun to see her as a limitation, Nova had begun to see him as a pattern. And patterns, once understood, rarely remain unpredictable. The introduction of Sienna Vale did not happen in a way that demanded attention. It was positioned, like many of Lincoln Hale's decisions, as strategy. "Brand alignment," he said one evening, scrolling through images on his phone. "We need a stronger visual presence. Investors respond to that." Nova sat across from him, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. She did not lean forward to see the screen. "What kind of presence?" she asked. Lincoln turned the phone toward her anyway. A series of curated photographs filled the display. Clean lines controlled lighting, a woman who understood angles and attention. "Sienna Vale," he said. "She's been working with a few emerging tech brands. Strong following, good engagement." Nova studied the image briefly. Sienna's expression was practiced, approachable without vulnerability, confident without effort. It was not authenticity. It was precision. "And her role?" Nova asked. "Public-facing," Lincoln replied. "Campaigns, events, media. She helps shape perception." "Perception again." Nova nodded once. "Then she'll need clear parameters." Lincoln smiled faintly, as if the concern were unnecessary. "It's handled." That phrase had become more frequent. It replaced discussion. It ended inquiry. Within weeks, Sienna's presence extended beyond marketing materials. She appeared at product launches, standing beside Lincoln, with an ease that suggested familiarity. Interviews began to include her, not as a spokesperson, but as part of the narrative. "Hale Dynamics is redefining how people interact with technology," she said during one segment, her tone polished. And Lincoln's vision is at the center of that. The phrasing was intentional. Lincoln did not correct it. He reinforced it. At first, the overlap between professional and personal remained ambiguous. There were no explicit confirmations, no public declarations, only proximity, shared laughter in photographs, subtle physical alignment in interviews, a timing of appearances that no longer felt coincidental. Nova observed all of it. Not through gossip, not through secondhand reports, but through direct sources. Press releases, recorded segments, scheduled appearances. Data. One evening, as Lincoln prepared to leave for another event, Nova asked, "Will Sienna be there?" Lincoln paused just long enough for the question to register as something more than casual. "Yes," he said. "She's part of the campaign." Nova nodded. "Of course." He waited, perhaps, expecting more. There was nothing else. He left shortly after. The apartment grew quiet again, not with absence, but with clarity. Nova turned to her tablet, opening the shared calendar Lincoln had stopped updating consistently. She cross-referenced it with public event listings, media schedules, and internal company announcements. Patterns emerged. Sienna's involvement was no longer limited to marketing cycles. She was present in strategic moments, investor dinners, private showcases, networking events, where visibility translated directly into opportunity. Nova adjusted her notes. Timeline expanded. Variables updated. The first direct indication came not from public appearances, but from a phone call. Lincoln had stepped into the adjacent room, assuming distance created privacy. The door remained slightly open, not enough to invite listening, but not enough to prevent it. Nova did not move. She did not need to. "I told you it's temporary," Lincoln said, his voice lower than usual, but not guarded enough. A pause. Then softer, more familiar. "You know it's different with you." The tone was distinct, not performative, not strategic, personal. Nova continued looking at her screen, her expression unchanged. "I'll figure it out," Lincoln added. "Just give me time." Silence followed. Then the call ended. Lincoln returned minutes later, composed as if nothing required explanation. Nova did not ask. Questions at this stage would not produce truth. They would produce responses, and responses could be managed. Instead, she marked the time. 7:42 p.m., duration 4 minutes 18 seconds. Content partial but sufficient. From that point forward, confirmation became a matter of accumulation. Messages appeared, not directly accessible, but indirectly traceable. Changes in scheduling, unaccounted gaps, behavioral shifts that aligned too precisely with Sienna's presence to be coincidental. Nova did not search his phone. She did not need to. Information reveals itself through structure long before it appears as evidence. Still, evidence would be necessary, not for confrontation, for completeness. Over the following weeks, Nova expanded her access. Email metadata, not content, but timing and frequency. Shared accounts logins, activity patterns. Financial traces, expenses categorized under marketing that extended beyond typical parameters. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they formed a consistent pattern. Lincoln's relationship with Sienna Vale had moved beyond professional alignment. It had entered personal territory. Nova did not react. Reaction would imply surprise. There was none, only confirmation. One afternoon, Daniel Reeves called. Her family's legal advisor had maintained a quiet presence in her life for years, never intrusive, always precise. "I received your request," he said. "You want preliminary structuring reviewed?" "Yes," Nova replied. "Not action, just assessment." Daniel paused briefly. "Understood. Is this time-sensitive?" "No," she said. "But it will be." He did not ask further questions. He didn't need to. Their communication had always functioned on clarity, not explanation. "I'll begin with the ownership layers," he said. "If there are exposure points, we'll identify them." "Focus on control," Nova added. "Not visibility?" "Of course." After the call ended, Nova remained still for a moment, not in hesitation, but in alignment. Everything was moving into place. Not quickly, but correctly. That evening, Lincoln returned later than expected. He moved through the apartment with a kind of distracted efficiency, checking his phone, removing his jacket, scanning notifications. "You're still awake?" he said, almost surprised. Nova looked up from her notes. "Yes." He hesitated near the doorway. "Long day?" She nodded. "I imagine." Another pause. "I'll be traveling more next month," he added. "Expansion meetings." Nova closed her tablet gently. "With Sienna?" The question landed without accusation. Only accuracy. Lincoln's expression shifted, subtle but visible. "It's part of the campaign," he said. Nova held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Of course." No confrontation, no escalation. Only acknowledgement. Lincoln seemed to wait again, perhaps for resistance, perhaps for something he could respond to. There was nothing. Eventually, he turned away. That night, the distance between them was not measured in space. It was measured in understanding. Lincoln believed the situation remained undefined, unspoken, unresolved, manageable. Nova understood that it had already resolved itself. Not emotionally, structurally. The replacement had begun. Not officially, not publicly, but effectively. And Nova, who had never relied on declarations to recognize reality, did not need anything more explicit than that. She did not confront the shift. She documented it. Because in her world, truth was not established by what was said. It was established by what could be proven. And she was not preparing to argue. She was preparing to confirm. By the time the truth fully surfaced, it did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as completion. Nova Whitlock had never relied on instinct alone. Suspicion to her was not a conclusion, it was a prompt. Something to be tested, measured, confirmed. And once confirmed, it required no emotional interpretation. Only response. She began with access points, not invasive ones, not reckless ones, structured ones. Lincoln Hale had grown more careless in his assumption of control. Success had given him confidence. Confidence had reduced caution. Passwords reused across platforms. Shared devices left unlocked. Notifications visible without concealment. He did not think of Nova as someone who would look. That assumption created opportunity. One evening, while Lincoln showered after returning from a late event, Nova remained in the living room. Her tablet open, connected to a mirrored account Lincoln had once set up for convenience. It synced selectively emails, calendar updates, fragments of communication not considered private enough to isolate. It was enough. She did not scroll randomly. She filtered. Dates first aligning communication spikes with known appearances of Sienna Vale. Then frequency identifying patterns and repetition. Then content brief controlled, but revealing in tone. There were no explicit declarations in the beginning. Only familiarity. "Made it back tonight was good. You handled that question perfectly." Professional language softened at the edges. Then gradually the tone shifted. "Wish you were still here. Call me when you can. Don't overthink it. It's already happening." Nova did not pause on any single message. She captured them. Screenshots, timestamps, metadata. Organized, categorized, stored. Evidence was not about volume. It was about coherence. As the thread extended, ambiguity disappeared. "You know I can't keep doing both." Lincoln's message. A delay. Then Sienna's reply. "You won't have to. You're already choosing." Nova read that line twice. Not for its meaning, for its finality. There was no anger in her response because there was no response. Only confirmation. She closed the application and returned the tablet to its place before Lincoln re-entered the room. When he did, nothing in her posture suggested awareness. He spoke about the event, who attended, what was discussed, which investors showed interest. His voice carried the same controlled enthusiasm, the same forward momentum. Nova listened. Not because the content mattered, but because alignment did. His narrative remained intact. That, too, was information. Over the following days, Nova expanded her review. Emails between Lincoln and Sienna moved beyond messaging platforms. Some were routed through secondary accounts, less secure, more casual. They were easier to access. "You should have stayed longer," Sienna wrote in one. Lincoln replied, "Couldn't. Timing matters right now. Sienna for who?" No answer recorded. Nova noted the exchange, not for emotional weight, for context. Simultaneously, she began examining financial records. Hale Dynamics maintained multiple expense channels, marketing operations, client relations. Within those, certain expenditures stood out. Travel arrangements categorized under branding initiatives. Luxury accommodations inconsistent with standard business bookings. Event-related costs that extended beyond documented functions. Nova cross-referenced dates, aligned them with Sienna's known schedule. The overlap was consistent, not occasional, systematic. She compiled the data into structured reports, clear, chronological, verifiable. Then she contacted Daniel Reeves again. "This has moved beyond assessment," she said. Daniel did not ask for clarification. "Understood. What's the scope?" "Marital dissolution," Nova replied. "And corporate exposure." A brief pause. "Do you want immediate action?" "No," she said. "Preparation first." Daniel's voice remained steady. "Then we'll need full documentation, financial, communicative, structural. No gaps." "There won't be," Nova said. And there weren't. Over the next 2 weeks, Nova finalized her documentation. Every relevant message archived, every financial inconsistency mapped, every ownership layer traced back to its origin, including the most important one, the funding. Hale Dynamics had grown under the assumption of diversified investment. Multiple entities, multiple sources, each appearing independent. But Daniel's analysis confirmed what Nova already knew. Control remained centralized, through Whitlock Capital, through Nova. Lincoln did not own what he believed he controlled. He operated it. That distinction would matter when the time came. The confrontation, when it finally occurred, was not initiated by Nova. It was initiated by Lincoln. He approached it indirectly. "Things are changing," he said one evening, standing near the window looking out over the city instead of at her. Nova sat at the table, reviewing documents she had already memorized. "Yes," she said. Lincoln turned slightly. "You've noticed." "I have," Nova replied. A pause. "I think it's better if we reassess," he continued, "the situation." Nova closed her folder gently. "What situation?" she asked. Lincoln exhaled as if the question complicated something that should have remained simple. "This marriage," he said. The word landed without weight. Not because it lacked meaning, but because its meaning had already been processed. Nova looked at him, calm, attentive, unchanged. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "A separation," Lincoln said. "At least for now." "At least," Nova repeated. He nodded, relieved by the absence of resistance. "It's just, we're not aligned anymore," he added. "Our lives are moving in different directions." The phrasing was deliberate, neutral, sanitized. Nova recognized it as such. "And Sienna?" she asked. Lincoln's expression shifted briefly, then corrected. "She's not the point," he said. Nova held his gaze. "She is part of the structure," she replied. Lincoln hesitated. "Then it's complicated." "No," Nova said quietly. "It's not." Silence followed. Not tense, not hostile, just complete. Lincoln seemed to wait for emotion, for reaction, for something that would validate the difficulty of what he was doing. Nova offered none. "Do you agree?" he asked finally. Nova considered the question, not its content, but its timing. Agreement in this context did not change outcome. It only defined process. "Yes," she said. Lincoln blinked, surprised. "That's it?" he asked. "That's sufficient," Nova replied. He studied her, uncertain. "You're not going to argue no?" Or ask why? Nova's expression remained steady. "I already know why," she said. Lincoln looked away first. The conversation ended there. Not because it was resolved, but because it no longer required continuation. That night, Nova finalized the next phase. Legal documentation initiated. Asset structures reviewed. Control points secured. She did not rush. She did not delay. She moved at the pace of certainty. Because by then, everything that needed to be understood already was. Lincoln Hale expected resistance. Not confrontation, he knew Nova well enough to understand she would not raise. Her voice would not argue in ways that could be easily dismissed, but he expected something. A delay, a negotiation, at the very least, a visible fracture. What he received instead was alignment. It unsettled him more than conflict would have. The divorce process began quietly. No public filing at first. No immediate announcements. Daniel Reeves handled the initial documentation with the same precision he applied to complex financial structures, methodical, controlled, leaving no exposure points. Nova reviewed every page before signing anything, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she understood the importance of framing. Divorce-like investment was not just about separation. It was about distribution liability and control. Lincoln approached it differently. To him, it was an exit, a necessary step toward a version of his life that felt more aligned with his current trajectory. He framed it in practical terms: efficiency, clarity, forward movement. "We can keep this clean," he said during their first formal discussion with attorneys present. "No need to complicate things." Nova sat across from him, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. "Define clean," she said. Lincoln glanced briefly at his lawyer, then back at her. "No public disputes, no unnecessary claims. We divide what's fair and move on." Fair. The word held weight, not because of its definition, but because of who was defining it. Nova turned a page in the document in front of her. "And your interpretation of fair?" she asked. Lincoln leaned back, slightly more comfortable now that the conversation remained calm. "The company stays with me," he said. "It's my work, my responsibility. You'll be taken care of financially, of course. Of course." Nova did not react. She noted the structure of the statement. Ownership assumed. Compensation offered. Control retained. Daniel Reeves spoke, then his tone measured. "Hale Dynamics is not solely owned by Mr. Hale. There are layered investments that need to be addressed." Lincoln nodded, dismissive but polite. "I understand there are investors. That's separate." Daniel did not correct him immediately. He allowed the statement to settle. Nova watched the exchange without interruption. She had no interest in clarifying prematurely. Information revealed too early loses leverage. "We'll review all ownership structures in detail," Daniel said finally, "before any division is finalized." Lincoln agreed easily. "Of course," he said, "whatever's needed." He believed transparency would confirm his position. That belief remained intact, for now. Over the next several weeks, the process moved forward. Documentation exchanged, assets listed, accounts evaluated. Lincoln provided what was required, but only what he believed was relevant. He did not conceal intentionally. He omitted by assumption. Nova, on the other hand, provided nothing unnecessary. Every disclosure was precise, every omission intentional. Her personal assets remained largely separate, protected through pre-existing structures, trusts, and legal frameworks established long before the marriage. Lincoln had never fully understood the extent of her financial position. He had never needed to. Now he still didn't ask. That too was noted. The settlement terms began to take shape. Lincoln retained operational control of Hale Dynamics on paper. Nova received financial compensation significant but structured in a way that appeared secondary to the company's valuation. It looked balanced. It was not. Buried within the agreements were clauses carefully worded, legally sound, easily overlooked without detailed analysis. Indirect ownership rights, deferred voting influence, conditional oversight tied to investment performance. Lincoln skimmed those sections. His attorney flagged them briefly. Standard protections, the attorney said. Nothing unusual. Lincoln signed. Nova signed. The marriage dissolved without spectacle. No court drama. No public statements. A brief filing process efficiently finalized without resistance. To outside observers, those who noticed it all, it appeared amicable. A quiet separation between two individuals whose lives had simply diverged. Lincoln moved forward quickly. Sienna Vale's presence became more visible, no longer framed as professional alignment, but as personal association. They attended events together openly now, Photographs circulated. Interviews shifted in tone. Support matters, Lincoln said in one feature. Having someone who understands the pace of this life, it makes a difference. Sienna smiled beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The narrative adjusted seamlessly. Nova was no longer part of it. And that, from Lincoln's perspective, was resolution. He relocated his primary residence within months, leaving behind the apartment he had once shared with Nova, moving into a space that reflected his current status more directly. Modern, visible, designed for impression. Nova did not contest the transition. She had already relocated. Her penthouse, positioned high above the city, offered a different kind of environment, controlled quiet, removed from unnecessary exposure. From there, she continued her work. Not visibly connected to Hale dynamics, not publicly involved in anything related to Lincoln. But structurally, nothing had changed. Funding channels remained intact, investment flows continued, oversight mechanisms embedded within legal frameworks remained active. Lincoln did not notice. Why would he? From his perspective, the system was functioning. Revenue increased, visibility expanded, opportunities multiplied. If anything, the removal of what he had once perceived as limitation had accelerated his progress. He attributed that acceleration to clarity, to freedom, to alignment with the right partner. Sienna reinforced that belief. "You're operating differently now," she said one evening, reviewing a recent article about him. "More confident." Lincoln smiled. "Because I don't have to hold back." She nodded, satisfied. Neither of them questioned what supported that confidence. Nova, meanwhile, reviewed quarterly reports, not emotionally, analytically, growth metrics, expense ratios, investment dependencies. She adjusted minor variables, nothing disruptive, nothing visible, just enough to test responsiveness. The system responded predictably, which meant it remained under control. Daniel Reeves maintained communication. "All agreements are in place," he said during one call. "You retain indirect influence across all major decisions," Nova acknowledged. "And exposure." Minimal, Daniel replied, "unless you choose to engage." Nova considered that. "I won't," she said. "Not yet." There was no urgency in her timeline. Because the outcome did not depend on speed. It depended on precision. Lincoln believed the divorce had ended their connection. In legal terms, it had. In structural terms, it had only redefined it. And Nova, who had never relied on visible positions to maintain control, understood something Lincoln did not. Separation does not remove influence. It clarifies it. Nova Whitlock did not rebuild her life. She reorganized it. The distinction mattered. Rebuilding implied loss, something broken, something needing restoration. Nova did not perceive her situation that way. Nothing essential had been taken from her. What had changed was alignment, and alignment could be adjusted. The penthouse she moved into overlooked the Hudson high enough to remove the noise of the city, close enough to observe its rhythm. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed a skyline that shifted constantly but predictably. Light changed. Movement continued. Patterns remained. Inside the space reflected function over display. Minimal design, clean surfaces. Technology integrated, not showcased. Everything had purpose. Everything was positioned for efficiency. Nova's wheelchair moved smoothly across the polished floor, guided not by hesitation, but by familiarity. She had adapted to it the same way she adapted to systems through repetition, calibration, refinement. There was no frustration in the movement anymore. Only awareness. Her mornings followed structure. Reports arrived before 7:00 a.m. financial summaries, investment updates, market analyses. Whitlock Capital's network extended across multiple sectors, and Nova reviewed each segment with the same level of attention. Not because she needed to control everything, but because she needed to understand it. Hale dynamics remained part of that network, not prominently, not visibly, but consistently. Nova did not isolate it from her review. She integrated it. Quarterly performance, revenue growth, operational expenses, strategic partnerships, all progressing, all dependent on inputs Lincoln did not fully recognize. He believed in momentum. Nova understood infrastructure. The difference defined everything. Late mornings were reserved for internal meetings, secure calls with analysts, advisors, and Daniel Reeves when necessary. Daniel adjusted quickly to the new phase. "The structure is stable," he said during one call. "You have leverage without exposure." Nova listened. "And Lincoln?" she asked. "Operating within expected parameters," Daniel replied. "Expansion-focused. Increased risk tolerance." Nova noted that. "Risk tolerance, when unsupported, becomes vulnerability. Continue monitoring," she said. "Of course." She did not ask for intervention, not yet. Afternoons were quieter, not empty, intentional. Nova used that time to review long-term strategies, new investments, emerging market sectors that required attention before they required urgency. She did not rush decisions. She positioned them. Evenings varied. Sometimes she attended private events, never publicly announced, always selectively chosen. Rooms where influence existed without cameras. Where decisions were discussed, not displayed. Other nights, she remained home, observing, reviewing, adjusting. Lincoln, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction. Visibility increased. His schedule filled with appearances, panels, interviews, networking events where presence translated into perceived value. Sienna Vale remained beside him. Consistently, effortlessly. Their dynamic had settled into something recognizable. Public alignment, mutual reinforcement, shared presentation. "You've become the face of this," Sienna said during one interview, her tone warm, admiring. Lincoln accepted it, not as flattery, as confirmation. Hale Dynamics expanded aggressively. New offices, new hires, new markets. Each decision pushed forward with confidence. Each one supported by capital flows that remained uninterrupted. Nova ensured that. Carefully, indirectly. She adjusted nothing significant. Only small calibrations. Delays in secondary funding. Reallocation of minor resources. Shifts subtle enough to go unnoticed individually, but measurable in aggregate. She was not destabilizing the system. She was testing it, its resilience, its dependencies, its thresholds. The results were consistent. Lincoln did not identify the source of those fluctuations. He attributed them to external variables, market conditions, operational adjustments, standard growing pains. He adapted. But his adaptations were reactive, not predictive. Nova recorded each response, not as criticism, as data. One evening, while reviewing a set of financial projections, she paused on a specific metric: cash flow timing. The delay was minimal, barely noticeable, without cross-referencing multiple reports. But it existed. She opened a secondary file tracing the source. A mid-level investment entity, one of several feeding into Hale Dynamics, had adjusted its disbursement schedule. That entity connected through 3 layers back to Whitlock Capital. Back to her. Nova had approved that adjustment. Deliberately. Not to disrupt, to observe. Lincoln's response had been immediate but not strategic. He compensated by increasing short-term expenditures, assuming acceleration would offset delay. It worked. Temporarily. But it increased exposure. Nova closed the file. The pattern was clear. Lincoln operated on forward motion. He did not account for structural shifts beneath that motion. Sienna, for her part, remained focused on visibility. Brand partnerships expanded. Her presence attracted attention, and attention attracted opportunity. But her influence remained surface level. She shaped perception, not foundation. Nova recognized that distinction immediately. It was not a criticism. It was classification. One night during a private investor gathering, Nova chose to attend a conversation, shifted briefly toward Hale Dynamics. Impressive growth, one attendee noted. Aggressive but effective. Nova listened without identifying herself. Another voice added, Hale's pushing hard. Might be stretching too thin. A third responded, that depends on how stable his backing is. Nova said nothing. The conversation moved on, but the question lingered. Stability. It was not visible, but it defined everything. Later that evening, back in her penthouse, Nova reviewed the latest projections again. Not for errors, for confirmation. The system remained under her influence. Completely. Lincoln still did not know. That was not an oversight. It was a condition. And conditions once established could be maintained. Or changed. Nova did not rush that decision, because timing in her world was not about speed. It was about inevitability. Lincoln believed he had moved on, that he had separated from a past that no longer aligned with his present. He saw Nova as part of that past, contained, concluded, irrelevant to his current trajectory. Nova did not correct him, because correction would have required visibility, and visibility at this stage was unnecessary. Control, when properly structured, does not need to be seen, only maintained. And Nova, who had spent her life understanding systems others overlooked, knew exactly how long she could maintain it. As long as she chose. Success, when it accelerates without resistance, creates its own version of truth. Lincoln Hale began to believe in that version. By the second year after the divorce, Hale Dynamics had moved beyond early-stage recognition into something more established mid-tier dominance, with the potential for larger acquisition or expansion. Industry publications referred to Lincoln as self-made, a term he no longer questioned. Why would he? The narrative aligned with everything visible. He had built the company. He had secured the deals. He had stood in front of investors and convinced them. The capital in his mind had followed his vision. And Sienna Vale stood beside that vision as its most visible extension. Their appearances became increasingly synchronized. At conferences, she was no longer introduced as a collaborator. She was part of the identity. The face of modern innovation, one magazine headline read, featuring both of them, Lincoln in a tailored suit, Sienna in controlled elegance, their proximity suggesting partnership beyond business. Lincoln did not correct the implication. Sienna did not clarify it. The ambiguity worked in their favor. Internally, Hale Dynamics expanded its operations. New departments formed quickly, sometimes faster than their integration could stabilize. Hiring increased. Infrastructure stretched to accommodate growth that outpaced initial projections. To Lincoln, this was momentum. To Nova, reviewing the reports from her penthouse, it was velocity without sufficient damping. She noticed the patterns immediately. Revenue increased, but so did expenditure. Margins tightened. Operational costs rose disproportionately in certain divisions. Marketing budgets expanded, driven in part by Sienna's growing influence. Brand campaigns became more elaborate, more frequent, more expensive. Each one justified as necessary for maintaining visibility. Nova did not interfere. Not yet. Instead, she adjusted one variable, a minor one. One of the mid-level funding channels, an entity positioned 3 layers removed from Whitlock Capital, slowed its disbursement cycle by just over 5%. Insignificant on the surface, unnoticeable in isolation, but measurable across multiple reporting periods. Lincoln noticed the effect. He did not identify the source. Instead, he compensated. "We need to push harder," he said, during an internal meeting, his voice carrying the same confidence that had once attracted Nova's attention. "Revenue is strong, but we're not scaling fast enough to match projections." A senior analyst hesitated. "Our burn rate is increasing." Lincoln nodded, already anticipating the concern. That's expected during expansion. The analyst did not argue. The room adjusted to Lincoln's certainty. Decisions followed. Increased spending, accelerated timelines, expanded commitments, each one logical within the framework Lincoln believed he controlled. Each one dependent on stability he did not verify. Nova documented every adjustment, every response, every deviation from sustainable structure. She was not looking for failure. She was mapping inevitability. Sienna, meanwhile, moved through a different layer of influence. Her presence brought attention. Attention brought partnerships. Luxury brands, lifestyle endorsements, cross-industry collaborations, none directly tied to Hale Dynamics' core function, but all reinforcing its image. "You're everywhere now," she said one evening, scrolling through her phone, as Lincoln reviewed documents beside her. Lincoln glanced up briefly. "That's the point." Sienna smiled. "Just don't forget what got you here." Lincoln returned to his screen. "I won't." The statement was immediate, unexamined. He believed it, because what had gotten him there, in his understanding, was himself. Nova, reviewing the same timeline from a distance, saw something else. Dependency. Not emotional, structural. Hale Dynamics relied on a network of financial inputs that appeared diversified, but were in reality interconnected. Remove one and the system adjusted. Remove several and the system strained. Remove the central node. The system collapsed. Nova did not remove anything. She adjusted timing. Again, another fractional delay, another slight reallocation. The effects compounded. Cash flow tightened. Not critically, but noticeably. Lincoln responded as before. Increased pressure, expanded outreach, more aggressive deal-making, short-term solutions applied to long-term variables. It worked. Temporarily. But each solution introduced new dependencies. Nova tracked them all. Her notes expanded, not emotionally, not judgmentally, but analytically. A system under stress reveals its structure more clearly than one operating smoothly. Hale Dynamics was beginning to reveal itself. One afternoon, Daniel Reeves called. "The board is starting to ask questions," he said. Nova adjusted her tablet, pulling up the latest reports. "About what sustainability?" Daniel replied. Nothing formal, just internal concerns. Nova considered that. "Who initiated it?" she asked. "Two external investors," Daniel said. "Minority positions, but experienced." Nova nodded. "They're early," she said. Daniel paused. "Do you want to accelerate anything?" "No," Nova replied. "Let it develop." There was no advantage in acting before the pattern completed itself. Daniel understood. "Understood," he said. After the call ended, Nova returned to her review. Lincoln's public presence remained unchanged. Confident, controlled, successful. Interviews continued. Appearances increased. His language remained consistent. "We're building something scalable," he said in one segment. "Something that adapts." Nova noted the phrasing. Adaptation requires awareness of variables. Lincoln adapted only to what he could see. The rest remained outside his model. That was the gap. Sienna's influence continued to expand within the visible layer. Her expectations grew with it. Travel became more frequent. Lifestyle more demanding. Her alignment with Lincoln remained strong as long as momentum continued. Nova recognized that condition immediately. It was not loyalty. It was alignment with success. If that success shifted, alignment would shift with it. Nova did not act on that observation. She recorded it. Patterns extended beyond financial systems. They existed in behavior, in relationships, in expectations tied to outcome. One evening, as the city moved below her in steady, indifferent rhythm, Nova closed her final report for the day. Hale Dynamics was still growing, still visible, still successful by every external measure. But beneath that surface, the structure had begun to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but precisely. And precision, unlike momentum, does not require speed to be effective. It requires timing. Nova leaned back slightly, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. Lincoln believed he was at the peak of his trajectory. He did not see the variables shifting beneath him. He did not see the system adjusting in ways he could not control. He did not see that the success he trusted most was the one thing he had never truly owned. The first signs of instability did not announce themselves. They appeared as minor inconsistencies, small enough to dismiss, familiar enough to rationalize. Lincoln Hale noticed them. He just didn't recognize them as connected. A delayed transfer here. An unexpected cost overrun there. Nothing alarming in isolation. But patterns rarely reveal themselves all at once. They emerge gradually until they can no longer be ignored. The first internal alert came from the finance team. Cash flow projections for Q3 are slightly off the head, analysts said during a scheduled review. His tone was careful, calibrated not to challenge, but to inform. Lincoln leaned back in his chair, scanning the report on the screen. How off, he asked. Within margin, the analyst replied, but trending downward compared to previous forecasts. Lincoln nodded once. Adjust the model. We already did, the analyst said. This is the adjusted projection. A pause. Lincoln's gaze remained on the numbers, his expression unchanged. What's driving it, he asked. Combination of factors, the analyst said. Increased operational costs, extended timelines on a few partnerships, and slight delays in funding disbursements. That last detail lingered. Which funding, Lincoln asked. The analyst hesitated briefly. Several mid-tier channels. Nothing major individually? Individually. Lincoln nodded again, dismissing the concern with controlled confidence. Then it's noise, he said. We're scaling. Variations are expected. The analyst did not argue. Meetings like this followed a rhythm. Information presented, confidence applied, direction set. And the system moved forward, but outside the meeting room, the adjustments required to maintain that forward motion began to accumulate. Lincoln increased short-term liquidity strategies, reallocated internal budgets, accelerated certain deals that might otherwise have developed more slowly. Each decision solved an immediate problem. Each one introduced new variables. He did not see the pattern forming, because the pattern was not visible from his position. Nova Whitlock, reviewing the same data from a different vantage point, saw it clearly. The delays she had introduced, fractional, controlled, almost imperceptible, were interacting with Lincoln's responses in predictable ways. He compensated by increasing pressure. Pressure increased volatility. Volatility exposed structural dependencies. She documented each phase, not to intervene, to confirm. Hale Dynamics was no longer operating within stable equilibrium. It was balancing momentum against emerging constraints. That balance could be maintained, for a time. Meanwhile, Sienna Vale began to notice something different. Not in the numbers. In Lincoln. You're distracted, she said one evening, watching him scroll through financial summaries instead of engaging in conversation. I'm working, Lincoln replied without looking up. You're always working, she said, her tone light but edged. That's not new. Lincoln exhaled, setting the tablet aside. We're expanding. It's a critical phase. Sienna studied him for a moment. Is something wrong? She asked. Lincoln shook his head. No, just adjustments. Adjustments usually mean something's off, she said. Lincoln smiled faintly, or that something's growing. She didn't press further, but she didn't fully accept the answer either. Sienna's world operated on perception, and perception, unlike financial data, shifted quickly. She began to notice small inconsistencies, a canceled trip that had been planned weeks in advance, a partnership announcement delayed without clear explanation, a tension in Lincoln's responses when questions moved beyond surface-level discussion. None of it confirmed anything, but it introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty in her world translated into risk. Back inside Hale Dynamics, the finance team continued to track the deviations. They became slightly more pronounced, still manageable, still explainable, but no longer negligible. We may need to review our funding structure, the head analyst suggested during another meeting. Lincoln's response was immediate. No structural changes, he said. We maintain momentum. The analyst hesitated. If the delays continue, they won't, Lincoln interrupted. We adjust around them. Confidence remained his primary tool. And it worked. For now, Nova observed his decisions with increasing clarity. He was not making mistakes. He was making incomplete calculations. He solved visible problems. He did not account for invisible ones. That distinction defined the gap between control and assumption. One afternoon, Nova initiated another adjustment. Slightly larger this time. Still within acceptable variance. Still unlikely to trigger immediate alarm, but enough to test system resilience under compounded stress. The result was immediate. A scheduled funding release arrived 2 days later than expected. 2 days did not seem significant. But in a system operating on tight coordination, it mattered. Lincoln noticed. This time, he didn't dismiss it entirely. Follow up on that transfer, he instructed his team. Find out what caused the delay. They did. The response came back vague. Processing issue. Resolved. It was technically accurate. It revealed nothing. Lincoln accepted it, because there was no clear reason not to. The question remained in the background, unresolved. That evening, he brought it up with Sienna. Just minor delays, he said, pouring himself a drink. Nothing serious. Sienna watched him. You keep saying that, she replied. Because it's true, Lincoln said. She tilted her head slightly. Then why do you look like it isn't? Lincoln paused, only briefly. Then it's just pressure. Sienna nodded, but her expression didn't fully soften. Pressure, she understood. Instability she did not tolerate. Nova, reviewing the same timeline, noted the shift. Not in the numbers, in behavior. Lincoln had begun to question slightly indirectly. Sienna had begun to observe more closely, more critically. The system was no longer just under financial stress. It was under relational strain. That convergence mattered. Because systems rarely fail from a single point. They fail when multiple pressures align. Nova did not accelerate. She maintained. Because the pattern was not complete. Not yet. Lincoln still believed he could stabilize everything. Sienna still believed the instability might be temporary. The board still observed without intervening. The system still held. But not without effort. An effort, when sustained against underlying imbalance, eventually reveals the truth. Nova closed her report for the evening, her expression unchanged. Everything was progressing. Not toward collapse, but toward exposure. And exposure, unlike failure, does not require destruction, only visibility. By the time Nova Whitlock began finalizing the file, nothing within it was uncertain. There were no assumptions left, no gaps, no variables unaccounted for. What remained was arrangement, presentation, timing. She did not refer to it as a case, not even internally. It was a structure, one that had already existed, now organized into a form that could be understood by those who required clarity, without interpretation. Daniel Reeves reviewed the compiled materials in silence during their scheduled call. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a rare note of emphasis. This is comprehensive, he said. Nova did not respond immediately. Is anything missing? She asked. Daniel paused, scanning again. No, he said. Nothing material. That was the only confirmation she needed. The file contained 4 primary components, each one complete, each one independently sufficient. Together they formed something definitive. First, financial origin. A full trace of capital flowing into Hale Dynamics from its earliest stages to its current structure. Layered entities mapped clearly. Investment vehicles identified. Ownership pathways outlined without ambiguity. Every path led back to Whitlock Capital. To Nova. Second, operational dependency. A detailed analysis of Hale Dynamics' reliance on those funding channels. Not theoretical, demonstrated through actual cash flow patterns, disbursement timing, and structural necessity. Without those inputs, the company did not sustain its current operations. Third, communication record. Not excessive, selective, precise. Messages between Lincoln Hale and Sienna Vale, establishing timeline intent and contradiction between private behavior and public positioning. Not for moral judgment, for consistency. Fourth, recorded admission. The most concise element. A brief audio file. Captured during a conversation Lincoln believed was informal. In it, his voice remained clear. I built this. The rest support background that's replaceable. No names, no context required. The statement stood on its own. Daniel reviewed that portion twice. Are you certain you want to include this? He asked. Nova considered the question. It's accurate, she said. It is. Daniel agreed. But it shifts tone. Then the tone shifts. Nova replied. There was no hesitation in her voice, not because the statement mattered emotionally, but because it completed the structure: perception, ownership, assumption, all aligned in a single line. Daniel accepted it, understood, he said. The next step was not filing, not yet. It was positioning. Distribution, Daniel asked. Controlled, Nova replied. Simultaneous. He nodded already, understanding. Key recipients, board members, primary investors, legal oversight bodies. Each would receive the file at the same moment. No staggered release, no opportunity for preemptive response, no space for narrative adjustment. Lincoln would not see it coming, not because he wasn't intelligent, but because he wasn't looking in that direction. From his perspective, the system still functioned. Strain existed, but it was manageable. He had experienced pressure before. He had navigated it. He believed this was no different. That belief remained intact, even as the file was finalized, even as the timing was set, even as the structure that supported him prepared to reveal itself. Nova did not rush the moment. She selected it. A public event, high visibility, maximum presence of stakeholders, the upcoming gala in Manhattan, fundraising, networking, media coverage, all the right people, all in one place, all expecting confirmation of success. Daniel understood immediately. Public exposure, he said. Accurate exposure, Nova corrected. There was a difference. She was not creating a narrative. She was revealing one. The days leading up to the event passed without disruption. Lincoln's schedule remained full. Appearances continued. Interviews reinforced his position. We're entering our strongest phase yet, he said in one segment. Everything is aligned. Nova watched the clip once. Not for content, for tone. Confidence remained absolute. That too was necessary. Sienna's presence remained consistent, visible, supportive, integrated into every major appearance. Their dynamic appeared stable, unaffected by the underlying shifts Nova had documented. But small signs had begun to emerge. Questions from investors, subtle, indirect, requests for clarification on projections. Nothing confrontational, not yet, but present. Lincoln addressed them with the same confidence he applied to everything else. Standard fluctuations, he said. We're ahead of where we need to be. The statements were not false. They were incomplete. Nova finalized the distribution list 2 days before the gala. Each recipient verified. Each channel secured. No errors, no duplicates, no omissions. She reviewed it once more. Not because she expected a mistake, but because confirmation was part of process. Then she closed the file. Everything was ready. That evening, Daniel called again. Once this is sent, he said, there's no reversal. Nova looked out over the city lights, steady movement, constant. I'm aware, she replied. Do you want any direct involvement, he asked. Present statement, no, Nova said. Her answer came without delay. This isn't about appearance. Daniel paused. Then what is it about, he asked. Nova considered the question briefly. Accuracy, she said. Nothing more, nothing less. The call ended. The next morning, Nova reviewed the timing sequence. Email dispatch synchronized with internal system triggers. Display integration aligned with event presentation software. Everything coordinated. Not dramatic, not theatrical, precise. She did not imagine the reaction. She did not anticipate outcomes, because outcomes were not variables she needed to control. Only the release. That afternoon, she closed her tablet and allowed the silence of the penthouse to settle. No movement, no adjustment. Everything that could be done had been done. Lincoln Hale across the city prepared for the same event. Different intention, different understanding. He reviewed his speech, adjusted phrasing, confirmed attendee lists. Sienna selected her attire with equal precision. Appearance mattered, presentation mattered, everything aligned. From his perspective, Nova did not attend the preparation. She did not need to. She would be there, but not as part of his narrative, as the point where it ended. The ballroom in Manhattan was designed to impress without appearing to try. High ceilings, controlled lighting, a balance between opulence and restraint that signaled influence more effectively than excess ever could. Every detail had been curated, every table placed with intention, every guest selected not only for presence, but for relevance. Lincoln Hale moved through the room with practiced ease. He greeted investors with familiarity, exchanged measured conversations with board members, acknowledged media representatives with the precise level of engagement required to maintain visibility without overexposure. Sienna Vale remained beside him, composed, attentive, aligned. Her presence completed the image. They did not need to announce themselves. The room adjusted around them. "Strong turnout," one investor remarked, shaking Lincoln's hand. "It's a good time," Lincoln replied. "Everything's moving in the right direction." The statement was delivered with confidence. It landed as expected. Reinforcement followed. Approval, recognition. Across the room, conversations carried similar tones. Growth, expansion, opportunity. No one spoke about instability, because no one at that moment had reason to. Nova Whitlock entered without announcement. No cameras followed her. No introductions marked her arrival. She moved through a side entrance, accessible, discreet, unobserved by most of the room. Her presence did not alter the atmosphere. Not yet. She wore no statement piece, no defining color meant to draw attention. Her appearance aligned with the space, refined, controlled, intentionally unremarkable. She positioned herself at a table near the front, not central, not hidden, within view of the stage. From there she observed. Lincoln had not seen her. He was engaged in conversation, his focus directed outward toward those who reflected his current position. That too remained consistent. The event progressed according to schedule. Opening remarks, introductions, acknowledgments. Each segment flowed into the next without disruption. Nova reviewed the timing internally. Everything aligned. The sequence would begin during Lincoln's keynote, not before, not after, during. When attention was fully directed toward him. When the narrative was most visible. Lincoln stepped onto the stage to a controlled wave of applause. Not excessive, appropriate, measured. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his posture relaxed, his expression confident. "Thank you for being here tonight," he began. His voice carried easily through the room. Clear, steady. "This isn't just about Hale dynamics," he continued. "It's about what we're building together." The phrasing was intentional, inclusive, strategic. He spoke about growth, about vision, about the trajectory that had brought the company to its current position. Each point reinforced the same message: momentum, control, success. Sienna watched from the side of the stage, her expression supportive, aligned with the narrative being presented. Nova remained still, listening, not to the words themselves, but to their structure. Lincoln positioned himself as the center of the system, the origin, the driver, the constant. It was consistent with everything he had come to believe, and everything the room expected. Midway through his speech, he shifted tone slightly, more personal, more reflective. "Success doesn't come without difficult decisions," he said. "There are moments where you have to recognize what no longer fits the life you're building." A subtle pause. The room remained attentive. Lincoln continued. "Sometimes that means leaving things behind, not because they weren't important, but because they no longer align with where you're going." The implication was clear, not explicit, but understood. A few heads nodded, recognition, agreement. Sienna's expression did not change. She had heard this framing before. Nova noted the phrasing, not for its meaning, for its timing. He had chosen to include it, here, now, in front of this audience. It completed the narrative he believed in. The room responded as expected. Light applause, not for the statement itself, for the confidence behind it. Lincoln allowed the reaction to settle before continuing. He transitioned back to forward-looking projections, future plans, expansion strategies, everything aligned, everything controlled, from his perspective. Nova did not move. Her attention shifted briefly to the small device positioned on the table beside her. Inactive, for now. The sequence approached its activation point, exactly as planned. Lincoln reached the final segment of his speech. "This is only the beginning," he said. "What we're building, what I'm building." He stopped for a fraction of a second. Not enough to disrupt the flow, just enough to register. Something had changed. Not in the room, in the system, behind the room. Nova's device activated silently. No sound, no visible signal, just execution. At that exact moment, multiple processes initiated simultaneously. Emails dispatched, attachments delivered, recipient lists activated, board members, investors, legal representatives, each receiving the same file. At the same time. No delay, no sequence. Simultaneous. Lincoln did not see it, not immediately. He continued speaking, but more importantly, he resumed recovering, without visible hesitation. It's something that reflects clarity, focus, the ability to move forward without another pause. Longer this time, not chosen, triggered. In the audience, subtle shifts began. Phones lit. Notifications appeared. Screens glanced at first isolated, then repeated. Conversations quieted. Not abruptly, gradually. Attention began to divide. Between the stage and what had just arrived in their hands, Lincoln noticed the shift, not the cause, the effect. He adjusted. A slight change in tone, an attempt to recenter attention. But attention once divided does not return immediately. It recalibrates. Sienna, standing near the stage, noticed it first. Not the emails, the reaction, the way expressions changed, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence. She glanced toward the nearest table. Someone was reading, focused, still. That stillness spread. Lincoln's voice continued, but its impact had shifted. He was still speaking, but he was no longer the center. Not completely. Nova remained exactly where she had been, unmoved, unobserved. For now. The system had begun to reveal itself, not through confrontation, not through announcement, through information, delivered, received, understood. Lincoln finished his sentence. But the room no longer responded the same way. The applause, when it came, was delayed, uneven, not absent, but altered. Something had entered the space, not visible, but undeniable. And for the first time that evening, Lincoln Hale did not fully understand what had just changed. The shift in the room did not erupt into chaos, nor did it produce any immediate confrontation. Instead, it unfolded in a far more controlled and unsettling manner, through silence, through attention, through the gradual redirection of focus away from the stage, and into the information now held in the hands of nearly every key individual present. Lincoln Hale remained standing beneath the soft, calculated lighting, finishing the final portion of his speech with the same composure he had carried from the beginning. However, the rhythm of the room had already changed, and while he continued speaking, the audience was no longer fully with him. Their attention fractured in subtle but undeniable ways. And even those who kept their eyes on him were no longer listening in the same way. Phones were not raised openly, nor were conversations immediately sparked. Instead, people read. They processed. They recalculated. At the nearest investor table, one of the senior partners from a New York-based fund scrolled slowly through the attached documents, his expression tightening not with shock, but with recognition. Across the room, another attendee adjusted his glasses and reread the first section, this time more carefully, as if verifying that the structure outlined could not be misinterpreted. The information was not presented dramatically. It did not accuse. It did not exaggerate. It simply clarified. Ownership pathways were mapped with precision. Funding origins were traced with undeniable consistency. The layered structure, which had once appeared diversified and independent, revealed itself as something far more centralized, far more controlled than anyone in the room had previously understood. And at the center of that structure was not Lincoln Hale. Sienna Vale sensed the shift before she understood it. Standing just off stage, she maintained her posture. Her expression still composed, but her awareness sharpened as she noticed the growing stillness among the audience. It was not admiration. It was not distraction. It was evaluation. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of a nearby screen where one of the event coordinators had inadvertently opened the same email. The subject line alone was enough to disrupt her certainty. She did not step forward. She did not interrupt. But for the first time that evening, she was no longer aligned with the moment on stage. Lincoln, meanwhile, continued speaking, though his internal awareness had begun to register the imbalance. He could feel it not as a clear understanding, but as a disruption in feedback. The subtle cues that normally reinforced his presence, the attentive stillness, the responsive expressions, the synchronized reactions, were no longer consistent. He concluded his speech without deviation, maintaining control over his tone and pacing, but when the applause followed, it lacked cohesion. It came in fragments, delayed and uneven, as though the room was responding out of habit rather than conviction. He stepped away from the microphone. His expression steady, his posture unchanged, but his attention sharpened immediately as he descended from the stage. "What just happened?" he asked quietly to one of his team members waiting nearby. The response was hesitant. "I'm not sure. People just started checking something." Lincoln's gaze shifted across the room, scanning faces, tracking reactions. He noticed the phones now, the subtle clusters forming the quiet exchanges, beginning to replace the earlier tone of celebration. Then his own phone vibrated. Once. Then again. Multiple notifications arriving in rapid succession. He glanced down his thumb, unlocking the screen with controlled precision. The email was already open by the time he registered the sender. He did not recognize the address, but he recognized the content immediately. For a moment, he did not scroll. He read the first section, then the second. His expression did not collapse. It did not fracture visibly. But something within it recalibrated confidence, shifting into concentration, certainty, into analysis. The document did not attack him. It outlined him. It presented his company not as an independent entity, but as a system built upon layered financial structures that ultimately traced back to a single controlling source. Whitlock Capital. Nova Whitlock. The name appeared without emphasis, without explanation, but its presence alone redefined the entire framework he believed he operated within. Lincoln scrolled further. Operational dependencies were detailed with clarity that left no room for dismissal. Funding intervals, cash flow timing, and structural reliance were presented not as theories, but as documented patterns supported by verifiable data. He continued reading. Communication excerpts followed. Not excessive, not invasive, but sufficient. Messages between himself and Sienna selected with precision, placed within a timeline that aligned with key business decisions and public statements. There was no commentary attached. There did not need to be. The contrast spoke on its own. And then the final element, the audio file. Lincoln hesitated before opening it, though the hesitation lasted less than a second. He pressed play, lifting the phone slightly closer as his own voice filled the quiet space around him. "I built this. The rest support background that's replaceable." The recording ended. No distortion, no ambiguity. Lincoln lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. Around him, the room had fully transitioned. Conversations were no longer speculative. They were informed. Investors who had once approached him with admiration now stood in measured distance, reviewing, discussing, recalculating positions that had been assumed stable only moments before. One board member closed his device and turned to another. "This changes governance," he said quietly. Another responded, "It changes control." Sienna stepped closer to Lincoln, her movement controlled but deliberate. "What is that?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Lincoln did not answer immediately. He was still processing, still aligning the information with what he believed to be true. "It's a misrepresentation," he said finally, though the statement lacked the certainty his earlier words had carried. Sienna studied him. "Is it?" she asked. Lincoln did not respond. Because for the first time, he was no longer certain of the answer. Across the room, at a table positioned within clear view of the stage, Nova Whitlock remained exactly where she had been since the beginning of the evening. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had not drawn attention to herself in any visible way. But the information now circulating throughout the room carried her presence more effectively than any introduction could have. She observed the shift not as an emotional event, but as a structural correction. What had been assumed was now clarified. What had been believed was now verified. And what had been invisible was now fully seen. Lincoln had built his narrative on control, on ownership, on the belief that the system responded to him. Now, for the first time, he stood within that same system and realized he had never been its center. The collapse did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded in layers, each one quiet, precise, and irreversible. Lincoln Hale remained standing near the base of the stage, the phone still in his hand, the screen dimming and lighting again, as new messages continued to arrive. He did not open them immediately. He did not need to. The information he had already read was sufficient to alter everything that followed. Around him, the room continued to shift not into chaos, but into recalibration. Conversations formed in low, controlled tones. Individuals who had once moved toward him now adjusted their positions, not abruptly, but with subtle distance. It was not rejection. It was reassessment. That distinction mattered. Lincoln looked up, scanning the room again, this time with a different objective. He was no longer searching for validation. He was identifying variables, who had read, who had understood, who had already begun to reposition themselves in response. His executive assistant approached, her voice kept low. "The board members are asking for clarification," she said. Lincoln nodded once. "Tell them I'll address it." When she asked. Now he said. The word came out with more force than necessary, not as a display of authority, but as an attempt to reassert control over a situation that had already begun to move beyond it. He stepped forward, not returning to the stage, but positioning himself within the room, where he could be seen, where his presence might still anchor the narrative. This document, he began, his voice steady, but no longer carrying the same effortless confidence, contains interpretations that need context. The phrasing was deliberate. Interpretations, context. He was attempting to reframe. But reframing requires uncertainty in the original information. And the file had provided none. One of the investors, an older man who had previously expressed strong support for Hale Dynamics, looked up from his device. "Is the funding structure inaccurate?" he asked. Lincoln held his gaze. "It's more complex than what's presented," he replied. The investor did not look convinced. "Complex doesn't mean incorrect," he said. A brief silence followed. Lincoln adjusted his posture slightly. "The company has multiple investment layers. That's standard." Another voice joined, this time from a board member. "Standard diversification doesn't usually trace back to a single controlling entity," she said. Lincoln turned toward her. "It's not control," he said. "It's support." The distinction in his mind still existed. In the room, it did not. "Support that determines cash flow timing," the board member replied. "Operational capacity, strategic flexibility." She paused. "That's control." The word settled heavily, not because it was spoken loudly, but because it aligned too precisely with what the document had already established. Lincoln's response did not come immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because every answer now required verification against information he had not previously considered. Sienna stood slightly behind him, her presence no longer aligned with the center of the room. She watched the exchange carefully, her expression no longer composed for public perception, but sharpened by private calculation. "This wasn't disclosed," she said quietly, just loud enough for Lincoln to hear. Lincoln did not turn. "It wasn't relevant," he replied. Sienna's gaze shifted briefly toward the investors, then back to him. "It is now," she said. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than anything that had been said publicly. Across the room, another development unfolded. Legal representatives present at the event in a general advisory capacity had begun reviewing the documentation more closely, One of them approached a cluster of board members speaking in low, precise language. Based on this structure, he said there may be governance implications that require immediate attention. Such as one board member asked. Authority over executive decisions, the lawyer replied. And the validity of certain unilateral actions taken without acknowledgement of underlying ownership. The conversation remained contained, but its implications extended outward. Lincoln became aware of it. He moved toward them, his steps controlled but purposeful. I'd like to understand what's being suggested, he said. The lawyer turned to him, professional, composed. At this stage, nothing is being suggested, he replied. Only reviewed. Lincoln held his gaze. And your initial assessment, he asked. The lawyer did not hesitate. That the ownership structure outlined here, if accurate, places ultimate control outside your direct authority. Lincoln's jaw tightened slightly. If accurate, he repeated. The lawyer inclined his head. Which can be verified. There was no accusation in his tone. Only process. That more than anything destabilized the situation further. Because process does not react. It proceeds. Sienna stepped back, not dramatically, not visibly to the entire room, but enough to remove herself from the immediate center of the situation. Her attention shifted not away from Lincoln, but away from alignment with him. She observed, calculated, repositioned. One of the investors approached her directly. Did you know about this? He asked. Sienna paused, a fraction of a second. Then, no. The answer came clean, uncomplicated. And in that moment, she separated her position from his. Not publicly, but effectively. Lincoln saw it. He did not react outwardly, but he registered it. Every shift, every distance, every recalibration. Across the room, Nova Whitlock remained seated, unmoved. Her presence still unnoticed by most, though a few had begun to trace the name in the document back to the room itself. One investor, scanning the file again, looked up slowly, his gaze moving across the tables until it settled briefly on her. Recognition did not come immediately, but awareness did. Nova did not acknowledge it. She did not need to. The information had already done what it was intended to do. The system was no longer hidden. It was visible, and visibility changes behavior. Lincoln stood at the center of that shift, no longer directing it, no longer defining it. He was responding to it. And response, unlike control, always arrives after the fact. The board members began to move, not away, but into formation. A private discussion, immediate, necessary. Mr. Hale, one of them said, addressing him directly, "We'll need to convene an emergency session." Tonight, Lincoln asked. Yes, she replied. The word carried finality, not as a decision, as a requirement. Lincoln nodded once. He understood what that meant. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Sienna did not follow him as he moved toward the side of the room. She remained where she was for a moment longer, then turned slightly, engaging in a separate conversation, one that did not include him. The separation was quiet, but complete. Nova observed it all without expression. Not satisfaction, not vindication, only confirmation. The structure had revealed itself. The responses had aligned. And the system, once dependent on assumption, had transitioned into something else entirely. Clarity. Lincoln Hale had built his position on belief, on narrative, on the assumption that what he controlled was what he owned. Now, standing in a room that no longer responded to him the same way he began, for the first time, to understand the difference. The aftermath did not unfold in public, not entirely. What the room witnessed at the gala was only the surface and exposure, a shift in perception, a reordering of attention. What followed moved into spaces where decisions were made without audience, where language became precise, and where outcomes were determined not by reaction, but by structure. The emergency board session convened within hours, not in the ballroom. In a secured conference room on an upper floor of the same building, removed from the noise, insulated from speculation. Only those with direct authority were present: board members, legal counsel, select investors with voting influence. Lincoln Hale entered with controlled composure. not confident, not uncertain, but aware. Aware that the parameters had changed and that whatever remained of his position would now depend on how accurately he could navigate a system he had not fully understood until that evening. He took his seat at the head of the table out of habit. No one objected, but no one acknowledged it either. That more than any verbal correction signaled the shift. The documents had already been distributed. Printed copies now lay in front of each participant marked annotated reviewed. Daniel Reeves was present, not as Nova's representative in name, but as counsel connected to the underlying structures now under examination. Lincoln recognized him. They had met before in contexts Lincoln had not considered significant. Now the context had changed. The session began without ceremony. A senior board member, Margaret Ellison, whose authority had always been steady but rarely visible, opened the discussion. "We are here to clarify governance," she said. Nothing more, nothing less. The phrasing was deliberate, not accusatory, not defensive, procedural. Lincoln inclined his head slightly. "Then let's clarify it." Margaret glanced down at the document, then back at him. "The ownership structure of Hale Dynamics," she said, "as outlined here, indicates controlling influence originating from Whitlock Capital." She paused. "Do you dispute this?" Lincoln's answer came measured. "I dispute the interpretation of control," he said. "Investment does not equal authority over operations." Margaret did not respond immediately. She turned slightly toward the legal counsel present. "Clarify," she said. The lawyer, an experienced corporate specialist, adjusted his glasses and spoke with quiet precision. "In this case, the investment structure is not passive," he explained. "It includes conditional oversight, voting influence tied to performance thresholds, and indirect authority and through layered entities." He placed a hand lightly on the document. Operational independence exists only within those conditions. Lincoln listened, carefully. He had never heard it described this way before, not because the structure was hidden, but because he had never examined it from this perspective. "So you're saying," Lincoln said slowly, "that I don't control my own company?" The lawyer did not frame it as a contradiction. "I'm saying," he replied, "that control is shared and in certain scenarios, redefined." The room remained still. Margaret spoke again. "Those scenarios," she said, "are no longer theoretical." Lincoln understood. The financial inconsistencies, the delays, the pressure he had been compensating for were not random. They were structural signals. And he had responded without recognizing their source. Another board member leaned forward slightly. "There's also the matter of disclosure," he added. "These structures were not fully presented during previous governance reviews." Lincoln's response came more quickly this time. "They weren't hidden," he said. "They were part of the investment framework. Partially disclosed," the board member corrected. "Not fully understood." That distinction mattered now, because understanding defines responsibility. Silence followed. Not tense, deliberate, each person in the room recalculating position, risk, and outcome. Margaret closed her folder gently. "We need to move forward," she said, "which means addressing leadership." The word shifted the focus, not abstract, direct. Lincoln met her gaze. "I'm still CEO," he said. Margaret did not challenge the statement immediately. She clarified it. "You are currently in that role," she said, "but that role is contingent on governance alignment." Lincoln leaned back slightly. "And you're suggesting it's not aligned?" "I'm stating that it needs to be reviewed," she replied. The lawyer spoke again. "Given the documentation," he said, "there is sufficient basis to initiate a vote on executive authority." Lincoln's jaw tightened. "A vote," he repeated. "Yes," Margaret said. "No escalation, no dramatics. Just process." The room shifted again, this time into decision. Votes were not immediate. They were prepared. Positions confirmed. Implications understood. Lincoln sat still. For the first time since entering the room, he did not speak. Because speaking at this point would not change the structure. Only the response to it. Daniel Reeves remained silent throughout. He did not intervene. He did not need to. The structure he represented had already spoken, through documentation, through alignment, through inevitability. When the vote was called, it proceeded without interruption. One by one, measured, final. Lincoln did not look at each person as they responded. He did not need to. The outcome became clear before the last vote was cast. Not unanimous, but decisive. Margaret folded her hands. "The board has voted to suspend your authority as CEO pending further review," she said. Her tone remained even. Not punitive, not sympathetic, just accurate. Lincoln nodded once. Slowly. Not in agreement, in recognition. The position he had built his identity around had shifted. Not taken, redefined. "What happens next?" he asked. Margaret answered without hesitation. "Interim leadership will be assigned," she said. "Operations will continue under board supervision." "And me?" Lincoln asked. A brief pause. "Your role will be reassessed following legal review," she replied. The phrasing was careful, but its meaning was clear. He was no longer central. The meeting concluded without further discussion. No one lingered. No one attempted to soften the outcome, because there was nothing to soften. Process had been followed. Structure had been clarified. Outcome had been determined. Lincoln remained seated for a moment after the room began to empty, not because he was unable to stand, but because standing would confirm movement, and movement would confirm change. Eventually he rose, not quickly, not slowly, precisely. He left the room without looking back. Outside, the building had already returned to its normal rhythm. The gala continued in distant spaces. Conversations resumed, appearances maintained. But for Lincoln Hale, the system had shifted. Completely. And for Nova Whitlock, nothing had changed. Except that everything was now visible. The meeting between Nova Whitlock and Lincoln Hale did not happen immediately after the board's decision. It was not arranged in urgency, nor was it driven by necessity. It was scheduled. 3 days later, at a private office maintained by Whitlock Capital in Lower Manhattan, quiet, insulated, designed for conversations that required no audience and no interruption. Lincoln arrived 10 minutes early, not out of habit, out of recalibration. The past 72 hours had altered more than his position. They had altered his sense of sequence, how events followed one another, how control was measured, how quickly stability could shift into something else, so entirely. He had spent those hours in motion, calls, meetings, legal consultations, each one confirming what the board session had already established. His authority had not been taken from him arbitrarily. It had been redefined by a structure he had never fully understood. Now, he was beginning to. When Nova entered the room, she did so without announcement. The door opened quietly, closed just as softly. Her presence did not carry tension. It did not demand attention. But it settled into the space with a kind of completeness that Lincoln recognized immediately. He stood, not out of formality, out of instinct. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because neither relied on immediate words to define the moment. Nova moved toward the table and positioned herself across from him. The distance between them was deliberate. Not far, not close, balanced. Lincoln studied her, not as he had before, not as someone within his life, but as someone he was now trying to understand in a way he never had. "You planned this," he said. The statement was not accusatory. It was observational. Nova met his gaze. "Yes," she said. No elaboration, no justification. Lincoln nodded slowly. "I didn't know," he said. Nova did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist without interruption. Then that was part of the structure. Lincoln exhaled quietly, his hand resting against the edge of the table. "I thought I built everything," he said. The words were not defensive, they were reflective. Nova's expression remained unchanged. "You built within it," she said. The distinction landed clearly. Lincoln absorbed it. "I would have done things differently," he said after a moment. Nova tilted her head slightly. "Would you?" she asked. Lincoln paused. The question was not rhetorical. It required evaluation. "I don't know," he admitted. That answer carried more accuracy than certainty would have. Nova nodded once. "That's honest," she said. Silence returned, not uncomfortable, measured. Lincoln shifted slightly, his posture no longer defined by presentation, but by presence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. The question finally moved beyond structure. Nova considered it. Not briefly, fully. "Because you weren't asking," she said. Lincoln looked at her, the simplicity of the answer, more disarming than any complexity would have been. "I thought I understood," he said. Nova's response came without hesitation. "You understood what you could see. Another distinction. Another line drawn without accusation." Lincoln leaned back slightly. "I replaced you," he said. The statement held no pride, no justification, only recognition. Nova did not correct him. She did not soften it. She acknowledged it. "Yes," she said. Lincoln nodded again, slower this time. "I thought," he began, then stopped. The sentence did not complete itself. Nova waited. Not expectantly, patiently. Lincoln tried again. "I thought I needed something different," he said. Nova's gaze remained steady. "You chose something visible," she replied. The phrasing was precise, not dismissive, not critical, accurate. Lincoln let out a breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That sounds worse when you say it," he said. Nova did not respond, because it did not require response. The truth once stated clearly does not need reinforcement. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Lincoln looked down briefly, then back at her. "Was any of it real?" he asked. The question shifted again. Not about business, not about structure, about something else. Nova considered it carefully. "Yes," she said. Lincoln's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, when he asked. Nova's answer came without delay, in the beginning. Lincoln held her gaze, then nodded. He accepted that, not because it resolved anything, but because it aligned with what he remembered. And what he had changed. The room remained quiet, no tension, no confrontation, just two people sitting across from each other, no longer connected by the same structure, but still linked by what had once existed within it. "What happens to me now?" Lincoln asked. Nova did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the answer did not belong entirely to her. "That depends on what you do next," she said. Lincoln considered that. "Not on you?" he asked. Nova shook her head slightly. "No," she said. The word carried finality, not as rejection, as release. Lincoln leaned back, absorbing that. For the first time since the gala, the absence of control did not feel like something being taken. It felt like something being returned. Responsibility. He nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. Nova studied him for a moment longer. Then she reached for the folder placed beside her. She slid it across the table. Lincoln looked down at it, then back at her. "What is this?" he asked. "Final documentation," she said. "For your review." Lincoln placed his hand on the folder but did not open it. "Is this the end?" he asked. Nova's expression did not change. "It's the conclusion," she said. Another precise distinction. Lincoln let out a quiet breath. Then finally, he opened the folder. Inside, the documents were structured with the same clarity as everything else she had prepared. No excess, no ambiguity, just terms. Defined, complete. He closed it after a moment, not needing to read every page immediately. He already understood what it represented. When he looked up again, Nova was already preparing to leave. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Simply moving forward. "Nova," he said. She paused, not turning yet. He chose his words carefully. "I didn't see you," he said. Nova turned then, meeting his gaze one last time. "I know," she replied. No accusation, no regret. Just acknowledgement. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. Lincoln remained where he was, the folder still in front of him, the room now carrying a different kind of silence. Not empty, resolved. Outside, The city continued as it always had, unchanged, unaware. And Nova Whitlock moved forward without looking back, not because she needed to, but because there was nothing left behind that required her to stay. In the end, the story was never about revenge. It was about alignment, about the quiet difference between what is seen and what is real, between what is claimed and what is held. Nova never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never forced the truth into the open. She simply allowed it to arrive complete, undeniable, and exactly when it needed to. Lincoln believed success meant visibility, momentum, and control. And for a while, it did. But what he built stood on a structure he never questioned, supported by someone he eventually chose not to see. And when that structure revealed itself, it did not destroy him. It clarified him. Some endings are loud. This one wasn't. It was quiet, precise, and final. If this story stayed with you, I want to take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always grounding to know how far these stories travel. And if you value stories where truth unfolds slowly, without noise, but with weight, you already know what to do next. Stay.